If you haven't noticed, the world that we live in is changing. The United States of America is changing radically. The ground of America, and really the West at large, has shifted. Without anyone voting on it, without a revolution taking place, most of us didn't even notice it happened until we started watching the news in the last few years and say, what in the world is going on? We're probably too distracted by the right or the left or these or those things in order to recognize the core presuppositions that have radically shifted. And we all live in this world that is shifting, and as it's shifting, it's literally like the air we breathe, meaning the content we consume everywhere we go is all shifting with it. And what's happening is that shift is affecting you, it's affecting me, it's affecting the church, and it's affecting all of the United States of America. All right, so I'm going to do my best to explain what's going on here, what the bigger picture is. The world revolves around different cultural shifts, especially in the West that we'll talk about here, where it'll shift from one culture to another culture. You have what's referred to sometimes as first culture. First culture is pre-Christian. It's before the Christian. So when you talk about the West, you're talking about the Romans and the Greeks and things like that. First culture had tendencies to be, they had a lot of different gods. In fact, every village, every town might have a different god. There was no central thesis that everybody agreed with this one thing. In fact, that's why when you read the Old Testament, you constantly see this image of the gods of the Canaanites or the gods of the Philistines, because each group would have their own gods. It was pre-Christian, and the image that was often in their minds was if our God conquered their God, then our God was greater. That alone might help you read the Old Testament better. And many times they would take the gods that they conquered, put them into a pantheon, temple, wherever that was, and show my God was greater than that city's God. And usually those gods were territorial too, because the gods were only gods over that region. They weren't even considered to be worldwide gods. They were just gods over that had a fear of God. That was the dominant way of thinking. You had this fear. God was always out to against you. You had to appease the God. You had to sacrifice to the God in all of those different forms. They were highly spiritual. Virtually everybody would believe in God. It was highly spiritual. Pre-Christian. It was very different. It was a fear of God. And then, just like the world turns, we started turning into a different, because as the the eras will change. In fact, all of our world is built on this system that there is a progression and there's a constant cyclical change that happens. Whether you're talking about the grand scheme of the universe, the Milky Way galaxy, our solar system, what we call a year, what we call a month, whether we talk about the human body and how it constantly repopulates itself, really the entire world around us is built on this idea of cycles. Everything. God created it this way. Everything happens in cycles. Life, death, the circle of life, right? Everything happens in these cycles. It's just the way God created the world to form. In fact, Ezekiel would refer to it as a wheel within a wheel, which is just a great image of this constant shifting and this constant changing. It also looks a little like this ball moving. So what we're seeing is first culture then gave way to second culture that has lasted for a very long time, and that is the Christian culture. The Christian culture was very different. It was a monotheistic culture. All of a sudden, there's one God that rules the universe. It's not all these other gods. There's one God that, again, rules the universe, not just this territory. It was a creedal culture in many ways, that it revolved around creeds and central doctrines and this thing called the Bible. It uses this Bible that has these unchanging beliefs. That was new. And so all of this started to happen after the time of Christ. And everything shifted in the West is what we're primarily talking about right here as we're talking about America. But all these things primarily shifted, and we have spent a long time in a Christian culture. Now, that does not mean at all that everybody was Christians. Not by any means does that mean that. It just simply means the worldview that everybody shared was this baseline of Christianity. You go into a third culture, and I believe That's part of what we're experiencing today. Like the shifting that's happening within the solar system or all the way down to the human body, you end up with a shift that happens within our worldviews and our cultures around the world. But America's in the middle of one right now. This is a book, and if you were to read this book, you would go from the beginning to the end. It has a start time, it has an end time, right? The universe talked about last Sunday, if you were in our church, has a start time and it has an end time, scientifically and biblically. And if you were to take this book from the start to the finish, at some point in the way, you're going to go from section to section, right? Many books are divided up into 3, 4, 5 sections. I just read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's divided up into sections of the story. So these sections, as you turn the page, goes into a whole nother image, goes into a whole nother story a lot of times. Everything shifts. That what we are experiencing in America right now is the progression of a whole nother culture that is shifting, that many people, unfortunately, especially in the Christian world, because we get caught up in a Christian aquarium, our own little Christian fish tank, where everybody around us thinks like us. Turning, that now we are actually on the backside of the page turning across the United States of America. It is a new culture, it is a new worldview that many times we don't understand how it operates, and so we get frustrated by this new culture and this new view, and I don't understand, like, why do they think this way? What in the world's going through their minds? But that's what begins to happen. So, gets turned. That's how the revolution takes place. It always sets itself against the previous culture, but usually not until it has enough dominant force to be able to do it, right? And so you see this across, even from second culture to first culture. You sent Christian missionaries all around the world to teach people from first culture how to be part of second culture. And it was expected that you would now be part of the Christian culture and no longer part of the secular culture. Now, this can be a negative thing when it comes to colonization, because you can actually take a first culture person to American or teach them something else, not just Christianity, which is a negative thing. But in the sense that I'm talking about right now, it's really this idea that I'm going to set myself apart from it. I'm going to set myself against it and force them to, or want them to think like me. We call this Christian missionaries. Happens all around the world still to this day, but especially in that early time. Now we're seeing the same thing happen into third culture against second culture, which is where we are now being invaded by missionaries to help us and teach us to think like them, not like the old way. Does that make sense? I was just watching a documentary recently, and part of the documentary, it was on the Old West, and part of the documentary, it was talking about the Native Americans, and as the pioneers went west, they put the Native Americans in these reservations, and inside of the reservations, the government sent missionaries to teach them how to be like Christians. Of course, the documentary thought, this is the worst thing, and how could they possibly do this, da-da-da. Well, here's the simple fact. A culture will only last as long as we all think alike. Abraham Lincoln has that famous line, a nation divided against itself cannot stand, which was not his line, it was Jesus' line. He just changed the name, nation from kingdom. Well, here's the thing. We all have to think alike, but when we get divided in the way we think, we won't last. We'll end up infighting all over the place and arguing and bickering and fussing and all of that's going to happen. Our founding fathers knew that if we were to survive, John Adams actually wrote it this way. John Adams said that our nation would only survive as a Christian nation. If we are going to survive, we all have to think the same way. Now, you don't have to necessarily think the same Christian. And right now we're in a moment where the culture in third culture, or what I'm referring to as post-Christian, there are a lot of words you could use for this. I'm going to use the word post-Christian. But that culture is now setting itself against Christian culture. It's in a very real sense, it's anti-Christian. It's a reaction against Christianity. It wants to deconstruct Christianity. That's a word we hear a lot right now, right? Deconstruct. All these systems and all these ideas. And so we want to move forward in progress, but we want to do it without Christianity. In fact, I like how Mark Sayers would say it. He says, we want the kingdom without the king. We want all the benefits that Christianity gave us, and there are tons of benefits. If you enjoy a paycheck, that's a Christian idea. If you're middle class, that's a Christian idea. If you, like, literally, there's just so many. If you own property, those are Christian ideas that came out of the roots of Christianity. So much of what we stand on are Christian ideas, and we want those ideas to keep flourishing, but we want to do it without Christ. And that's where third culture starts to come in. I heard one atheist say it this way. I was listening to a podcast, and he was very honest about it. He said, where America is right now, he said, for years, think it this way. He said, we have cooked a bone broth with the bone in it, and the bone's called Christianity. And it has flavored everything else, right? You know how that works with a bone broth? He said, the bone has flavored everything inside the bone broth. He said, now we are taking the bone out with this great experiment to say, will it keep its flavor? Yes. That's a great analogy. And that was an atheist. And he was very honest about it. He said, I don't know. He said, I don't know where we're heading. Nobody knows where we're heading. But this is what we are attempting to do. So we want to get rid of all Christian things, Christian concepts, Christian teachings that would hinder anything in this new culture that's coming before it. Who was it? Christopher Hitchens. I was watching a thing with him one time, and he said, and just pull yourself in because it's pretty heavy. He said, oh no, I don't think all Christians should cease to exist. He said, I think Christians should be like animals within the zoo, that they exist only as a part of your history, that you can go back and see what they have done. You can learn and have them part of your history. They just have no effect on the future. Christians, you should be put in like a zoo type category where people can come by and see what you do and go, oh, that's so cute. You know, take pictures with the Christian, you know, eat their popcorn in front of the Christian, whatever. And so you get this idea, and with this idea, one of the things that's happening right now too, and I don't have time to unpack this fully, I wish I did, but one of the things happening right now is anytime you get from a culture to a new culture, you get colonization because the new culture wants to colonize the previous culture. And so you get the colonization that begins to happen. What's happening in a lot of places in America is the church is being colonized. Again, it's the air we breathe. It is everywhere. You cannot not be around it. I'm going to point some things out as we talk today to kind of make this picture, but it's everywhere. It's the air that we breathe. You cannot live in America without breathing this new culture, this secular, humanistic type culture. It's everywhere. And so without planning, without idea, it just starts to seep in. And we end up with an American gospel that looks very different than the actual gospel. It only works, sort of, inside of America. It's a prosperity-laden gospel, even if it's not the prosperity gospel. Everything, he has a hope and a dream for your life. Not that that's wrong, but what happens when God doesn't bless you and people that are Sauled in two? What happens to all the people who don't have the miraculous, like, and we sing songs about it. We fight against this in our church, but you know, you'll never ever let me down. What happens when God does let you down? We don't sing that song in our church. I don't know for anybody that knows that, because I'm like, God will let you down. Like, I know in the grand sense, like heaven and da-da-da, God's not going to let you down. But if you're just living your day-to-day life and you're expecting God to do this and he doesn't do it, you will feel let down. Anybody ever felt let down? But the colonization that's happening affects the church, and it creates this new gospel that we'll talk further about in a few moments. So these beliefs, they haven't been argued. They've just been assumed. Nobody has publicly made a proclamation for them. It's really what it is a worldview that has now permeated and has taken the majority of Americans, and this worldview is different than the old second era worldview. That worldview can go by several names, but secular humanism is the one that I was taught back in my apologetic days in my degree. So let me give you 7 secular humanistic beliefs of the post-Christian West, the post-Christian America. Let me give you 7 of them real quick, or somewhat quick. Number 1, the highest good is individual freedom, happiness, self-definition, and self-expression. The highest good is individual freedom. You need more freedom. Whether you have heard these exact words or not, you know this concept is very much across America. If you have more freedom, you'll be happier. The problem with that is it is totally not true. Sometimes the more freedom you have, the less happy you will be. In fact, you can go on missions trips all around the world where they have nothing, no money, no prosperity, and this and that, but sometimes they'll be happier than the American with all the prosperity. Freedom is a good thing, but if you have too much freedom, it can be a bad thing. That's why Paul would say the really kind of silly line. He said, "Is this for freedom you've been set free?" Hey, what? Of course, duh. But if you really start to ponder that line, it's because your freedom will destroy you and put you back into bondage the more freedom you have. So freedom by itself is a good thing, but if you have too much freedom, it can hurt you. Think of it this way. Oftentimes to have a life that matters, you actually need to limit your freedoms, and you will do things that limit your freedoms. For instance, you will get married. You will have children. You will have a job. All of those things limit your freedoms. Once you have a job, you don't get to do whatever you want with your hours that you're supposed to be at work. Once you get married, you don't have the right to do whatever you want to do sexually with other people. Not that you did as a Christian anyway, but you get the idea. Once you have children, all of a sudden your life starts revolving around them, and you will end up with a greater feeling of happiness and contentment. That's a better word because we were never promised happiness, but you will end up with this greater feeling of happiness and joy out of life when you actually restrict your freedoms, right? So you see that. And freedom by itself is a good thing, but too much is destructive. We see that right now. Again, about every 60 to 70 years-ish, there is a revolution in the United States of America that changes things. I don't know if you've ever caught on to this. You had the revolution, the War of Independence, then you have the Civil War, then coming out of the Civil War, you started to have the happen in the Great War, and then you had the World War I 70 or so years later, then you had the sexual revolution of the 60s, and now we are part of a whole nother one right now. I argued, as I did before, the sexual revolution started a page turning, whereas we are now on the other side of the page turning now. So the sexual revolution taught you, and it's so permeated into our culture that many of us just have accepted this idea that sex is good, and the more freedom you have with sex, the better. 60 or so some odd years later, as we are now living in the consequences of that, does that really work? Because now you end up with single mothers everywhere. And if you're a single mom, we love you. It's not that. This is just a big, broad picture. But you end up with single mothers everywhere, kids growing up without their fathers, poverty, moms working 3 jobs, trying to take care of things. Why? Because we wanted more freedom. Well, freedom sounds real good. More of it, until you get on the other side of it sometimes, and it becomes actually destructive. So it is for freedom. You've been set free. So use your freedom to have freedom, not to cause destruction. So we get this idea of personal freedom lauded. Now, number 2, traditions, religions, received wisdom, regulations, social ties that restrict individual freedom, happiness, self-destruction, and self-definition, and self-expression must be reshaped, deconstructed, or destroyed, right? All right, so any of these traditions, Christianity being the really big one, needs to be deconstructed. Anything that's limiting my freedom, anything that's holding me back, needs to be deconstructed and changed through politics, social reform, whatever. You're about to hear a great talk on the critical theories, critical race theory, queer theory, the critical theories coming up in a few moments. This talk really probably sets up that talk in a lot of ways. And this idea of freedom. And if you limit my freedom, I have to stand against you. And again, it's freedom without responsibility, which is destructive. Number 3, the world will inevitably improve as the scope of individual freedom grows. Technology, and particularly the internet, will power this progression to utopia. So we want our ethics, but we want to do them without Christianity. Things are inevitably going to improve. This is part of that secular humanistic worldview. We're going towards a utopia where everything is perfect, where everything is great. We're creating heaven on earth, but we're creating heaven on earth without God. So the kingdom without the king. And so we're creating this secular humanistic utopia. Everything is going this way, and nothing can stop it. That's a key part of it. We're just naturally going this way. Nothing's going to be able to stop it. So all these things, it'll be a perfect place of equality and justice and peace. And in some ways we see that. We'll talk about that in a minute. In other ways we don't. Number 4, the primary social ethic is tolerance of everyone's self-defined quest for individual freedom and self-expression. Any deviation from this ethic of tolerance is dangerous and must not be tolerated. Logic, professor, how does that add up? So many things like social justice become less about social justice in a moment like this and more about a self-expression and personal autonomy. I've said this before, but a lot of what we're calling social justice right now is really anger over things. And it's destructive at its core. While we definitely believe God's throne, according to the psalmist, we definitely believe in those things, but if we're not careful, we're going to do them out of a rage that is not about justice, it's about revenge. But now I'm stepping into other people's things. Number 5, humans must be inherently good. Now, this is one that's funny because even when I have talked about this with my apologetics group, it's funny the pushback because we've breathed this air for so long across the United States of America that many of us actually believe this very same thing. Humans, we got to be inherently good. And so when I say the Bible teaches that you are, people are like, no, we are good. Okay, I'm not saying you don't do good things. I'm not saying you don't have good character. I'm just saying inherently, if you've left to yourself, if you knew you could get away with it this afternoon robbing a bank and you knew you would not get caught. We got a bunch of bank robbers across this room. Right? We are not inherently good, right? We are good ultimately because there's consequences for being bad. We are not inherently good. We could talk at length about that, but we are not inherently good. But we've been living this idea for so long, it just starts to seep in. It's part of every kids movie that we watch for a long time. So have you noticed that every kids movie, every Disney movie, every kids movie has the same theme? Be you. No matter what everybody, just be you. Be you. And I'm like, have we ever, is there another theme? Like just be you. Well, the problem with just being you is what if you is a bad person? If you are inherently good, then yes, just be you. But if you are not inherently good, be like Christ. Don't be like you. But it has saturated into our culture so much. All right, number 6, large institutions are suspicious at best and evil at worst. We are against institutions in general. Number 7, forms of external authority are rejected and personal authenticity is lauded. And so what happens is this idea of a Christian foundation, we want to get rid of it, but we want to build upon it. Think about that. The old argument I've heard said many times is you're like standing on a limb and you're trying to saw the limb out from underneath you as you're trying to go higher. It doesn't really work. In fact, I don't have a lot of time, but I will share this with you. When I was on a prayer retreat and I was at the Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, Virginia. Anybody ever been there? It's where like Thomas Jefferson went to church, George Washington, a lot of our founding fathers went to church at the Bruton Parish. And I was on a prayer retreat, and so I was inside the Bruton Parish, and I was just praying, seeking God, and God began to give me this vision. I don't know that it's earth-shattering for anybody, but in the moment, as God gives revelation, it always is. And so I'm praying, and I begin to see this vision. And you ever see like the old-timey houses that are built, and it's almost like there's stones stacked up that become the foundation. That's what's getting it off the ground. And I saw America, and the foundation were these books. And it was book upon book upon book, and it was there. And the books were crumbling underneath it and being pulled out at the same time America was expecting to build higher. The foundations of America, the Christian ethics, these freedoms, these American ethics are being pulled out from under us at the same time we're trying to go higher. And it won't work. It won't work. So let me give you some observations, some reflections. I got 12 minutes and I need like 2 hours. So I'll do these as quick as I can. 12 observations. In many ways, larger American cities are living in the progressive utopian vision. First of all, just call it what it is. This idea of this utopian place, your city, including and you will find that vision being played out. Think about it. You can eat anything you want to eat. You can do anything you want to do for the most part. You can have sex with anybody you want to have sex with for the most part in Tampa, right? And we're not even like the biggest city, and we're very much in the Bible Belt, right? But this utopian vision is being played out in front of us. The problem with that, and we see it in Tampa, is that it doesn't actually work because at the exact same moment that you can go get your $7 cup of coffee with exactly what turmoil and suicidal thoughts, especially with the younger generation, which is a wild thing because all disregard or ugliness towards them. But the stress and the things they have is nothing compared to previous generations. World War II generation, these different generations that were literally fighting in combat at 18 years old. And in the middle of that, there's so much anxiety and stress. That's not supposed to be that way. It's a secular. Except the things that actually matter the most. Because when you get into a materialistic worldview, everything is on the external. So I've got all the external things I could ever want while having none of the internal characteristics and integrity and character, those things that I need inside. And so I end up with everything on the outside, but nothing on the inside. So we have nice coffee, but we have no sense of meaning. This should be a big moment for all of us to step back and go, something's not right. But yet you see this plowing, we're going to just medicate everything. It should be, remember the old canary in the coal mine? You would send the canary into the coal mine to know if there was to know if you were safe. Well, what we're doing with this is there's a canary in the coal mine that's dying in front of us, but yet we're still plowing into the coal mine. So, all right, number 2, in post-Christian society, politics becomes the new religion. This is where it gets fun, because all of us are experiencing this in our day-to-day lives right now. So we need some kind of vehicle to get us to this utopia, to this secular humanistic idea at the end. That vehicle used to be the church and Christianity and those things. Now we need a new politics becomes that vehicle. So let me say this, and I think some light bulbs will make sense. Science becomes the new Bible. That's the standard of truth. 75 years ago, the Bible was the standard of truth. People just believed it. We said things like, I believe it because it's in the Bible, and it's in the Bible because I believe, whatever, those things we said. Science becomes the new Bible now. If you really want to say what is true, just show science, not the Bible. Government becomes the new church, or the hope, the place of hope. The government is the one that's going to save us. The government is the one that's going to take care of us. Now, in this room, a lot of people shaking their heads no, but look around society. Politics become the new pastors. We become the new preachers of this new gospel. Because of time, I'm going to go ahead and just jump ahead. There's a new post-Christian gospel story. So there's a new gospel story that fits in with this whole Christian worldview that I bet you've heard as well. In fact, you've probably heard it quite a few times, especially if you watch Hallmark TV or Lifetime or all those. Let me tell you, I'm going to make this up real fast, but let me tell you my version of the story. You've all heard this story before. Let me see, who can I pick on in this room? Okay. Jose and Marisol. Jose and Marisol are a young couple. This is the beginning of the story. It's beautiful. They are in love. Jose is the baseball star. I'd put it in football, but you love baseball. So Jose is the high school baseball star, the captain of the team, all this. Marisol's the sweet little Christian girl that's never really done much wrong. And they're like this Indiana, because that's always the picture of small town USA. And so they're in Indiana. They're high school sweethearts. Everything is perfect. They love each other. They graduate. They're in college. And now they're planning to get knows them, and they're both virgins, and this whole picture happens, right? But then all of a sudden, Marisol decides she's going to go on a backpacking tour across Europe. And as she goes on the backpacking tour across Europe, she goes with some friends and this and that. She meets Ty. Ty rides a motorcycle. Ty wears a leather jacket. Ty drinks. Ty does everything that Jose didn't do, right? And so she ends up in this conflict because she's really attracted to Ty, and Ty's the bad boy. Ty's the one that, he's nothing like Jose. Jose's the good kid. He's the all-American kid that you're supposed to be like. But Ty, he's just a little wild. While Jose doesn't know anything about it, jumping on the back of Ty's motorcycle and running off into the European sunset and riding, and they're going to the clubs together, and they're dancing together, and they're having fun together, and all this kind of stuff. And she's loving it because all the restraints of Indiana are suddenly gone, and she's experiencing this whole other life, and she's loving every minute of it. This is so good. And then the trip has to end. So she goes back home to Indiana. But while she goes back home to Indiana and Jose, her heart is going, what about Ty in Europe? And she's in this, so she's in this pull back and forth, which one she's going to do. And she has a wedding coming. So the wedding I'm going to spend the rest of my life in one world or another. And so the wedding day comes, and they're getting ready in the bridal chambers, and the mom is right there. Says, what's wrong? And Marisol just opens her heart and she says, well, nobody knows about this, but when I was in Europe, and she explains the whole story, and the mom starts crying, and the mom says something like when I was your age, I had a fling with somebody beside your father, and I've always wondered what it would be like if I had gone with him instead of your daddy. Come on, y'all seen this movie? And she says, you should at least try, just go for it, just go for it. And so Jose at the altar runs and jumps on an airplane, flies all the way to Europe, where you see her jump on the back of the motorcycle with Ty and drive off into the sunset as the whatever it's called starts going down, right? Have y'all seen this movie? You know what you just saw? It's a new gospel. It permeates our society and it's everywhere. Throw off the old religion, throw off the old things, because new worldview where you don't have the restraints of the old one. You've been taught, because you've seen those movies your whole life, that you need to get rid of that old ideas, those old ways of thinking, those old institutions, that old church, those old moralities, all of those old things, because there's a better life on the other side if you'll just cast that off and run. So there's this whole gospel story. Have you noticed that? Let that sink in. The Christian gospel is going to save you from sin. It's going to save you from eternal damnation. The new gospel is going to save you from these old institutions, these old ideas, these old moralities, and set you on a life of freedom. You ever notice the story always ends when she jumps on the back of Ty's motorcycle? Because if it were to keep going, it probably doesn't end happily ever after. But that's my opinion. So you get this new gospel. Say, I'm liberated. I'm free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. But what are you free from? I'm actually free from God. Because of this new worldview, I'm liberated from the very things that I feel like have held me back to experience the future freedom. Probably one of the biggest things that I've seen happen lately is that the perceived moral high ground has shifted. I've said this repeatedly, but I don't feel like any of us were ready for this. This is one that I think has caught all of us off guard. And if you're honest, it's happened so quickly that you're like, what? So a great example of this is this, or that kind of thing, right? So I'm not that old. I'm 43. I'll be 44 in another month and a half, so I'm close to 44. I'm not that old, but when I was a teenager, say 25 years ago, it was considered to be the moral high ground not to sleep around. That was considered to be good, right? My friends and all that. Now, we might not do it, but we knew if somebody was not sleeping around, that was a good thing. So they were more everybody would have agreed to that. That was kind of the standard understanding that was around us. Shifted recently, very recently, to now all of a sudden, if you don't sleep around, you are repressing your sexuality. Now, if you tell other people not to sleep around, you are oppressing their sexuality. Now you are more immoral by not sleeping around than the person who is sleeping around who is now more moral than you are. Have you seen this? You might not have heard it articulated this way, but look around our society. It's watching this shift play out, and we're like, what in the world is going on? It's a different worldview. It's a different era that we're stepping into. A lot of you who are part of our church at Arise, and I know everybody here is not necessarily, but a lot of everybody who's a part of our church at Arise, you see these things played out all the time because I'm trying to recognize them and tilt us back in the right direction constantly. It's the air we breathe in the United States, and so without planning, you will naturally start thinking this way. I mean, just when did it happen Ada and I just celebrated our 21st anniversary. When we got married, it was not common for people to live together before they got married. Right? Anybody married around the same time? That was only 21 years ago. Like, I'm not saying it didn't happen. It did happen for sure. It's as if it's always been that way. It's as if, like, well, that's just the way it's always been. Will you move in with me? And when did that shift happen? And like the sexual revolution, on the end of it, we're probably not into it far enough to give the real consequences. It's going to have some real consequences. It's all about freedom. All right, let me hurry up. I got 10 minutes. Religion, number 3. Religion has a tendency to make people dogmatic, angry, and ready to fight. Anybody ever notice that? Religion has this tendency, like hopefully we are not really part of a Christian religion, but we're about relationship. But religion by its nature has this thing that just makes us want to argue and fight, right? Here's the thing about that. If politics has replaced religion in the United States, look what's happening with politics. Everybody has their opinion, and we are dogmatic about it. It looks a lot like 1983 Christianity. It looks a lot like the church that I grew up in the parking lot. Like, you ain't never seen a fight till you've seen a church fight. Because Christians, man, like we are dogmatic, and it is my way or the highway when you get religious, right? And it looks almost like going back in time to the church, what we're experiencing within politics. And we will hate people that are both Americans, both Christians, because we have different worldviews. Thank God most of this seems to be changing, it seems like to me, for a while now. But like, I grew up in Pentecostals, and Pentecostals hated Baptists. To be in heaven together, right? Like it's different theologies, but yet they would fight and bicker. It's almost like Republicans and Democrats and the bickering that goes on. It is funny, isn't it? In a world where, in the church world, we have fought hard not to be religious. Anybody watch The Office? We have fought hard not to be Angela on The Office. She is that stereotype Christian who looks angry at everything and is against everything. And we have fought hard in the Christian world to not be that any longer. At the exact same moment, the world just became religious and took that spot. Frustrated. So you see this idea of intolerance all over inside of that looks very religious in its nature. And like the church in the 1980s with the angry church lady who's just frustrated at everything. It doesn't like anything that's not what they want. And we've all seen that in the church, but now we're seeing it in our own eyes with this new politics, this new religion of politics. All right, number 4. As we moved into post-Christianity, secularist culture, as soon as you have a majority in the fight, now you are no longer attacking, now you are defending. Many of us grew up in a world where our Christian values, they were being attacked, so to speak. It's now switching to where it still feels like an attack in some regards, but it's really a defense of the one who now holds the prominence within our society. So what we call, here's a great example. So many of us will get frustrated with cancel culture, right? Anybody, like that's, whoever has the majority can cancel the minority. Christians were involved in cancel culture for years. They called it boycotting. Let that sink in. I don't like what that Disney's doing, right? We're not going to Disney anymore in our church. It's cancel culture. You had the majority, therefore you had the power to try to stop something. Now they have the majority. They're trying to stop something. We called it boycotting. They call it cancel culture. You may not like it, but it is what it is. And so now they are defending what they have through cancel culture, just like we used to. They are defending what they have. It's not about attacking anymore. It's not about just think of it this way. Attacking kind of is the big moment that you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe you would do that, right? Like the famous, forgive me, but the famous Piss Christ picture is a picture of a crucifix inside of a bottle of pee. That was a famous picture, right? And most of the Christians were like, oh my God, I can't believe you would do that. You don't see that stuff anymore now because it's no longer, you're like, oh, that's common. So it's not attacking you anymore. It's defending the ground. That image right there. So I'll end with this. I got 5 minutes to tell you this last. If you want more depth, come to our Q&A lunch. We can talk a long time about this kind of stuff. Follow some of my Creating the Future podcast. We talk about different things like this in the Creating the Future podcast. Okay, let me end with this thing, because if I don't give some kind of hope, we're all going to end this session kind of like, oh my God, the world's going to end. And here's the thing. The world's been turning for a long time. It'll keep turning. Christians are best during hard times, not during good times. In fact, the Christian church during good times usually doesn't do a very good job. But a remnant that's rising up. But let me tell you, let me paint the bigger picture, because I've shared some of that in our church before. Let me paint the bigger picture. I hear a lot of people saying, can America be saved? I'm always the one that says God's not interested in saving America. He's interested in saving you and I. But ancient Judah, several thousand years ago, ancient Judah has gone through years and years, decades of evilness. They have set up now idols and false idols, all is beginning to rear its head again. Prostitutes, temple prostitutes, all these things are going up. Asherah poles that you might hear mentioned in the Bible. Killing of children and burning children and child sacrifice and things. And so these gods, they have kind of come across the world. All of a sudden, this young boy gets made king. His name is Josiah. Josiah becomes king. And somewhere as he becomes an adult, they find the scroll of the Lord in the temple. And when they find it, they seem to have forgotten their way. They seem to, I don't really remember what we were supposed to do anymore. Now we're so far into this, we don't. And so he finds the scroll of the Lord, begins to repulse, takes down the gods of Baal, leads this whole beautiful repentance moment. Now let me, without angering you, let me try to paint this picture. God had already said Israel was doomed. It was already in motion. It was already said. Israel, as we know it, Judah, the nation is going. Messiah's goal to rescue Judah. It seems to be his goal to be obedient to the scroll, to God, to the law. That's a beautiful thing. He's not trying to save the nation that God's already said is done. He's trying to save the people. Now get this. Judah has their time. Josiah's reign ends. All of a sudden, they are exiled. The whole Babylonian exile that you know all about. The Babylonian exile begins to happen. One of the things that it's being referred to as today is digital Babylon. Not sure if you've heard this. There's this whole digital Babylon online where people have a whole new world. So you have this digital Babylon in our world. You have this actual Babylon, and the exiles go out. And you get these exiles like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Ezekiel. Those are 4 big ones right there, or 5 big ones right there that you all have heard of. They are incredible. They're incredible. Recognize they are stepping into a world that's more grand than they could ever fathom, this Babylonian world with the hanging gardens and wonders that these poor Jewish kids have never seen. At the exact same time, in that mentality, again, gods had regions, and their gods seem to be stronger than your God because they just took over. And in that, you see Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego specifically all saying, we will not defile ourselves with the king's food. Food's a big temptation for me, at least. So we're not going to defile ourselves with the king's food. Years later, you still see Daniel praying multiple times a day, and that's the only thing they can do on the lion's den thing. You have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the whole fiery furnace. They refuse to bow down. You have Ezekiel standing up as a prophet at that time. Those 5 people, let me ask you this big question. Where did those kids, because that's what they were when they went into exile, where did those kids get that foundation from that would then lead back to eventually the Messiah? Where did they get that from? What we don't often notice, They all grew up during the time of Josiah. Josiah, this one who said, I don't care if we lose the nation, like I don't want to, but God's already said, my interest is following Christ. And he became a rock star of his day. In fact, it said of Josiah that no king ever led a repentance and coming back to God like Josiah did. Hezekiah's right there too, but like Josiah. And he was a rock star of his day. And all the little ones that were growing up watched Josiah and the way he lived, and they all wanted to emulate Josiah already in Josiah's court before he was ever exiled. So all of this, you get this picture. And so Josiah mentored and put such an impression, such a God impression on these Hebrew kids that years later, Daniel still. Years later, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going, I'm not going to bow. Think about that. I believe as Christians that one of the greatest things we can do during this era is stop trying to worry about all these big pictures and start focusing on our children and prepare them for what's coming. And you might be preparing Daniel's, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Ezekiel's in your own household, in your grandkids, because as they go into a digital Babylon, it is going to be these people that hold tightly to truth that are becoming more and more valuable, and God is going to use them greatly. And just like with those kids, they end up exalted inside of kingdoms and used as salt and light inside the pagan world. You have your children and grandchildren who will be used by God. And I believe with all my heart, Josiah becomes a picture of what you and I should be during this time. That we go back to the old ways. We go back to the Christian character that we know we're supposed to have. Impress that on our children and grandchildren, because they're going to walk into an exiled world and they're going to need it. And if you pour it into them, they can actually change that world because of what you put into them now. Does that make sense? Jesus, Lord, we love you. We praise you. You are so good to us. And I know, as is going to happen in every session, I'm sure this morning, we just gave a lot. But Lord, I pray that the nuggets of truth of our spirits, and that big nugget of truth that we have got to invest in these children of ours, these grandchildren of ours. Lord, I pray that nugget especially would ring in our ears. Lord, let us be Josiah-type figures that go back to the old ways and impress that on our children and grandchildren so that they can influence the way you're calling them to. Not only will they survive, they will thrive during this next season, just like happened in the Old Testament. Let it happen with us. Let them be extremophiles, not just surviving, but thriving in the most adverse circumstances. Amen. Amen.